Shepherd podcast. As always, I'm your host, Pastor Jay, and wanted to do something special for this last podcast I'm going to do for the year. I'm going to be out of town the next couple of weeks for visiting my family in South Carolina for Christmas, and so this will be the last podcast of the year, and I'll pick it back up come January in the new year, and we'll start a new series, and hopefully we'll have my good friend Travis will be back with us again in the new year. And so, but for this last one, I wanted to do something I like to do come Christmas time, is really kind of smash some of the traditions and the myths, the common myths that we have about the Christmas story and about the Nativity. And so I wanted to take a look at the Bible story in Luke and in Matthew about the birth of Jesus, and some of the commonly held myths that we have, and how we're actually wrong about a lot of these things that you see in the traditional nativity stories. The traditions, the customs that have been brought to us, over the centuries, nearly 2,000 years, and even in modern times with Christmas cards and plays and Christmas movies. A lot of them get the details about the Bible story completely inaccurate and completely wrong, and we have the wrong idea about a lot of these things. And so I wanted to talk about some of these things. And I'm going to start off with one that you probably already know, but just in case you didn't, this is going to rock your world. Jesus was not born on December 25th. We know that almost certainly. Jesus was not born on December 25th. Now, that does not mean that it's a bad thing to celebrate on that day. Christians have been celebrating the birth of Jesus for since about the late second, early third centuries after Jesus in the AD, and so it's not a bad thing to worship on that day. It doesn't really matter what day it is. We just chose that date centuries ago as the date that the church as a whole would worship Jesus on that day. Now, you may have heard, well, the Christians took the pagan festival of Saturnalia and made it a Christian festival. That's actually inaccurate. Saturnalia starts on the 16th or the 17th, I believe it is, of December, and ends by like the 22nd or the 23rd. And so, sure, it's around that same time, but it's not the same thing. Some have suggested, well, it was during the reign of Emperor Aurelian, I think it was, that the pagans started worshiping Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, and that festival was on December 25th. However, there are references in Christian writings, early church fathers, as much as 50 to 100 years before Aurelian started that they were already worshiping or talking about Jesus' birth being on December 25th. So, contrary to popular belief, and I actually may post in the bottom in the comments below, I may post an article or a video from Dr. Michael Heiser where he discusses his Christian Christmas, a pagan holiday, and he talks about all this in detail. But no, December 25th, even though we're pretty sure it is not Jesus' birthday, that is the date that we celebrate, and it was not pagan. It was actually from early Christian times. They had calculated that was the date that it was. And that's when they kind of celebrated it. And so it was really sort of codified. There were some different dates and different possibilities that different areas of the church in the Roman Empire were worshiping on different days. Early December, early January, some different dates there, but they codified it, I believe the Council of Nicaea in 323 AD. That was one of the many things that they covered in that first big ecumenical council there. They kind of codified December 25th as the date of the Christ Mass, which is what Christmas is, and so that's when they did that. But no, that's not when Jesus was born. Actually, there's interesting evidence to suggest that Jesus was born on September 11th, 3 BC, and I'm not going to get into that now. I may do that another time, and it's based a lot, interestingly enough, on the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation chapter 12, and the astronomical signs that are given in the first couple of verses of Revelation chapter 12, but I'm not getting into that today, but it's some pretty compelling stuff there. Maybe I'll do that as another podcast. But December 25th, not Jesus' actual birthday. The second thing I want to do is I'm going to read just the first couple of verses here of Luke chapter 2. It says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went out to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. So, i.e., Joseph was born in Bethlehem, came from Bethlehem, that's where his family was, and at some point he moved up north to the Nazareth region where he was betrothed to Mary. All right? And so, as they have to go back to their hometown for the census. And so, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. All right, well, that's really about it. And it's interesting, all the additional stuff that we add to this story. For example, I mean, I've just watched it this weekend with my kids. There's a popular movie that came out here a year or two ago called The Star. And it's about the donkey, I think his name was Bo, that Mary rides, going into Bethlehem, and how she the donkey saves Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus from the Roman soldier, or I think it was Herod soldier, and all this kind of stuff. And so we have this image of all the Christmas cards, all these paintings, you have this image of Mary riding a donkey. There's no donkey mentioned in the story. That's an assumption. And it's actually kind of a bad assumption, because a donkey was not a cheap animal. They were pretty expensive, and Mary and Joseph, we know from the Bible, were dirt poor. They give like the poverty offering when they come to be cleansed after the birth of Jesus. And so I think it was the 2 turtle doves. They give the lowest possible offering because they were dirt poor. They were not well-to-do at all. They weren't even middle class, if you will. They were very, very extremely poor. And so it was unlikely that they would have owned a donkey, and certainly wouldn't have ridden a donkey. Most people walked in those days, and so they probably walked. Well, that brings up the next question. Well, how could a 9-month pregnant woman who is imminently about to give birth have walked the 50 or 60 or so miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Well, that brings up another point. Nowhere in this story does it say, in the Gospel of Luke, does it say that she was 9 months pregnant and imminently about to give birth when they got to Bethlehem. That's an assumption that we make from all of these traditions and these myths and these cultural references, that we think, they arrived in Bethlehem like that morning, and then by that night she was giving birth to Jesus. That's not what it says. It says while they were there. And the implication in the Greek is that they had been staying there for some time. While they were there, the days were complete for her to give birth, is what it says in the Greek there. And so it was quite likely they probably traveled when she was maybe even 5 or 6 months pregnant, maybe 7 months pregnant, but certainly she could have been there for several weeks, if not a couple of months, staying in Bethlehem before she gave birth to Jesus. So it was not quite that instantaneous. I mean, you understand why they do that in the movie. Or why they do that in certain media things, because they have to condense the storyline and make it work, but that's not what the Bible story says. And so then this brings us to yet another issue. There's a character that shows up in every Christmas play and in all the movies and everything, and that is the character of the innkeeper, who tells them, no vacancy, there's no room in the inn, but you can stay in my stable. In the barn over there with the animals. There's no innkeeper mentioned in the story at all. And in fact, I'm going to put a side note to that as well. There's no inn mentioned in the story. And you may say, wait a minute, Pastor Jay, they're said right there at the very end of verse 7, she laid him in the manger because there was no place for them in the inn. And that's true. That's what the English version says, but that's not what that word means in Greek. And it's unfortunate that it still gets translated that way in a lot of versions of the Bible. I've seen a couple that actually use the correct word, which is guest room. The word is in Greek, I believe, is kataluma. It means guest room. It's the same exact word that gets used of Jesus and his disciples in the upper room when they're holding the Last Supper. It's the same word that's used in the book of Acts for the upper room where the disciples were gathered and praying before the Holy Spirit came upon them at Pentecost. And so it's a different word. There's a whole, I don't remember what it is, but there's a different Greek word completely for an inn, or what we would consider a hotel or motel kind of thing. First of all, Bethlehem was a tiny town. They wouldn't have even had an inn, and there's no archaeological evidence that they had an inn. That word shows up elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke in the story of the Good Samaritan, when the Good Samaritan brings the injured man, he brings him to an inn, which is a different Greek word, and pays the innkeeper to take care of him while he goes on his travels. And so it's not an inn, it's a guest room. Well, what is a guest room? And I'm going to put this picture up on the YouTube side here so you can see it. But if you look on this picture, this is a general sort of first century styled house in ancient Palestine, in ancient Judea. And it's generally 2 levels with a roof on top, and the open bottom level is where they would keep the animals and where they would keep the kind of the cooking in the kitchen, and sort of they have the sort of the stable area there for the animals that they would house within their house, not a separate stable. That's the whole separate issue. And then you would go up the ladder or the stairs, and there would be the family room and a guest room or an upper room where generally people would gather together. Or they would rent that out, or family would stay in. And then sometimes if the weather was nice, they would even sleep on top of the roof. All right, and so when it says there was no room for them in the guest room, and remember, Joseph is from this town, this is his family that he's visiting, he's probably staying with family, but remember, all the family has to come and register here, so you've probably got several generations of Joseph's extended family all staying in this one house. And so, yeah, there were other people there, and maybe even elders to them, who would have gotten priority over the guest room. And so Mary and Joseph would have been sleeping, maybe in the storage closet downstairs. But since that was kind of tight space, they would have come out into the open area where they could do the meal preparation and things like that, where there would be a manger in order to give birth. And the Greek in this passage actually accounts for all of those things if you go and do some of those studies on that. So to recap for you, there's no donkey because she probably was not imminently giving birth. So they stayed there for a little while. There's no innkeeper because there's no inn. They're staying with family, and the upper room, the guest room, is full, so they're probably staying in the downstairs storage area. And because there's no room in the storage area for her to give birth and to spread out, so to speak, they go out into the open area and they lay him in the manger. Which brings us to the other point. There's no stable or barn. We always see that they're like, well, there's no room in the inn, so they go and stay in a barn. Well, there's no barns in ancient Palestine. You've seen some people have said, well, there's a cave, and I think actually the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem today is over the space of a cave that was possibly used as a stable type thing. Well, that may be true, but that generally wasn't the case. Like I said, most people kept their animals in their house and stabled them inside that open area in the first century houses. All right, so no donkey, no inn, no innkeeper, no stable. And then fifthly, you notice something else about the story. If you go on and read in Luke, you'll read about the shepherds and the angels that come and talk to them, and they go and see the child and whatever. But you notice something that's in every nativity story, every nativity scene you see, and every movie or story you've seen about it, and that is the wise men. Where are the wise men in the story? Well, the wise men actually come from the Gospel of Matthew. They don't show up in Luke at all. And interestingly enough, if you go and look at the Matthew account, it's a completely different angle on things, because they didn't come the night of the Nativity. They came up to a year and a half to 2 years later. When you look at the Matthew account, it says they come to a house where Mary and Joseph are staying, and they are talking to a toddler, is the word there. A toddler is the child, not an infant, a newborn. It's a different word in Greek that you see in Luke. There's an infant, a newborn that the shepherds come to see, but it's a child, a toddler-aged kid that the wise men come to see. And then there's a couple of issues about the wise men too. How many wise men are there? Well, everybody always says there's 3. Well, they think there's 3 because there's 3 gifts that they bring, but the Bible actually never says how many there are. There could have been 2. I mean, there's more than one, so there could have been 2, there could have been 4, there could have been 12, there could have been 25 for all we know. It could have been a huge entourage. We don't know how many wise men there were. We just say there's 3 because there was 3 gifts, but that's not necessarily the case. And so I mentioned all of these things just because there's all of these things in this story that we read our culture and media and things into the Bible that simply aren't there. And I want to, as much as possible, try to read the Bible for what it is in its original context, in its original culture, and try to understand what the Bible actually says rather than eisegesis, which is reading my modern perspective into the Scripture. And so, as always, we do this with a lot of the Bible. But the Christmas story seems to be one of the worst examples of that because it's such a well-known story. And so, but we don't know it as well as we think we do, as I've just shown you. And there's probably a dozen other things that I could talk about, but I think I'll just kind of leave it there. That's probably enough to rock your world if you've never heard any of these things before. And so I'm going to leave it there for it. But I hope you guys have a Merry Christmas. I hope you remember the real reason for the season, Jesus Christ coming, that first Advent, God stepping into our world and taking on human form and tabernacling, dwelling among us. What a beautiful, wonderful thing that was, and punctuated even more so with his death and resurrection that brought salvation and life to us, and looking forward to that day when he comes again, that second Advent. So Merry Christmas to you, Merry Advent, and I hope see you in the new year. Have a happy new year. Catch you next time.